For more on the citizenship card issue, we go now to Executive Director for the U.S. Campaign for Burma, Simon Billenness. Mr. Billenness, how are you today?
I am fine.
Could you describe for me how you got involved in Rohingya issues?
I've been working on human rights and democracy and social justice in Burma for over 20 years now.
So, Simon, I'd like to detail this political ping-pong played by the Myanmar government concerning these citizenship cards. A parliament member of the National League for Democracy recently tabled a motion in Parliament to deny white card voting rights in the referendum. Parliament approved it by a large majority and sent it to the president for his signature, but subsequently the president, Thein Sein, sent the bill back to the parliament with a comment that white card holders would be allowed to vote in the referendum. Then Parliament approved the bill with a large majority and the president signed it into law. A few days later, however, the president signed a decree declaring that white cards will not be valid after the 31st of March and must be surrendered by the 31st of May. The following day, Rakhine Parliament members, together with the help of some of the members of the NLD, sent the law to the Constitutional Tribunal to clarify whether the bill violates the Constitution. The tribunal nullified it, saying that it did in fact violate the Constitution. Do you feel this event was pre-planned from the beginning?
Well, I think it is wise to assume that a lot of what the Burmese regime is doing in terms of discrimination against the Rohingya is pre-planned. What you have here is what is ostensibly still pretty much a military regime that's desperately seeking any way to build up its legitimacy and to distract people from its trying to stack the elections and from its continuing domination of the economy through its crony businessmen, and we're seeing in the growing restrictions on the Rohingya is the regime seeking to curry favor with this sort of nationalistic, anti-Muslim tendency and prejudice within Burmese society, and use that to distract people away from forms of resistance against the regime. For instance, the growing student demonstrations for educational reform. I'm never surprised when I see restrictive measures being enacted on the Rohingya and violence against the Rohingya. Oftentimes promoted by the regime, because these things often occur, funnily enough, when there's growing popular support and organizing around economic issues and around fully democratic elections and so forth. So, yeah, I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of oppression of the Rohingya is planned by the regime to desperately seek support and to distract people.
For more than 2 years now, thousands of Rohingya have been living in IDP camps, and those who aren't in IDP camps are essentially living in open-air prisons, with pretty much every aspect of their life severely restricted. The extortion, false allegations, harassment, imprisonment of Rohingya people in Arakan by local Buddhist authorities and the so-called border guard police is beyond reprehensible. As an advocacy group like your U.S. Campaign for Burma, what do you think the future holds for these issues?
We are a human rights organization, and so the discrimination and denial of basic rights of the Rohingya in Burma is definitely the most egregious discrimination and oppression that we see against any ethnic minority in Burma. And that's saying quite a lot, given the extent to which the regime has discriminated against and is still, in many cases, waging war against different ethnic minorities in Burma. So what I expect to see is particularly in the lead up to the elections that are expected in November of this year. I expect to see a lot more efforts by the regime to deny the Rohingya their basic rights and to use that to, curry favor with this sort of nationalistic constituency in Burma, which seems to be the regime's, only possible source of any kind of significant support.
So, Simon, what would be your advice to the Obama administration concerning Burmese policy?
Our advice to the Obama administration has been very clear, and that is to highlight the fact that, and underscore the fact, the regime, both on human rights and on restoring democracy, has been backsliding ever since 2012, when the U.S. largely dropped and suspended its sanctions on Burma. And, I think we were very successful working with a number of other groups, including many Rohingya rights organizations, to, before President Obama went to Burma in November of last year, to make it very clear that he needed to signal that the regime was backsliding on reforms, and that if President Obama wanted Burma to be a foreign policy success, that the U.S. administration needed to put a lot more effective pressure on the Burmese regime to properly reform. So, we've seen some good rhetoric and language from the U.S. administration. I think we've seen a lot better language from the U.S. administration as we've seen from the European Union and the UK government in particular. But the U.S. administration needs to back up its words with some effective actions. Putting more, political and economic pressure on the Burmese regime and their business backers would be very good. And also particularly on, any member of the regime that can be linked to, violence and discrimination against the Rohingya and against other ethnic minorities in Burma.
Now, Mr. Billenness, do you think the U.S. government would reconsider bringing back sanctions? And do you think that would help the issue?
Yeah, because I think it's quite clear that sanctions do have a clear effect on the Burmese regime. That was, and it's notable that since sanctions were dropped and suspended, the regime has backslid. And so would be looking to press the U.S. administration to, unsuspend or add some existing targeted restrictions and sanctions on the regime, to make it very clear that the U.S. will back up with effective pressure what it's demanding the regime to do.
Simon, that's all I have for you today. Did you want to offer any closing remarks?
Well, I think, I actually want to express my thanks and appreciation to you and everyone else who have been, clear and active in highlighting and being active in support of the Rohingya in Burma. And I think it's important to realize that this repression of the Rohingya is the most egregious example of how the regime, still essentially a military regime in Burma, is using every means available to it to try and retain power. The repression of the Rohingya is designed and planned to be a distraction from the regime's efforts to stay in power. And it's important to understand that as a means of figuring out how we can stop the regime and make it very clear that there's a very high price it will have to pay if it continues with this repression of the Rohingya.
Mr. Billenness, thanks for your kind words, and thank you again for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Simon Billenness, Executive Director of U.S. Campaign for Burma.